Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper's reign of terror began around 1888 near the East End of London, England. The targets were typically found late at night or in the early mornings near the Whitechapel district, often in dark and secluded places. His methods of murder were strangulation and/or inflicting a knife wound across their throat. Sometimes the victims would have their internal organs removed, suggesting he had knowledge of the human anatomy. Authorities received numerous letters claiming to be from the killer. The most famous, known as the Dear Boss letter, was signed Jack the Ripper, which is how the killer got his name. Another notable letter, the From Hell letter, was accompanied by half a preserved human kidney. Jack was infamous for the brutal murders of at least 5 women. Jack the Ripper became one of the most infamous serial killers in history, inspiring countless books, films, and theories. He was never caught and his identity remains unknown, making his legacy one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in criminal history. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He had a troubled childhood and was described as a shy and withdrawn child. Dahmer developed an odd fascination for dead animals at an early age. This only grew deeper during his teenage years. His first murder took place shortly after graduating high school in 1978. He found a hitchhiker, lured him to his house, and bludgeoned his victim with a dumbbell before strangling and dismembering the body. It was about 9 years later when Dahmer began his killing spree. Between the years of 1987 and 1991, he murdered 16 more young men and boys. His methods involved luring victims to his apartment, where he would drug, strangle, and dismember them. What was shocking was that he also engaged in necrophilia and cannibalism. On July 22, 1991, Dahmer was finally apprehended after one of his intended victims escaped and flagged down police. When police entered Dahmer's apartment, they found photographs of dismembered bodies and human remains, including severed heads and a heart in the refrigerator. In 1992, he was charged with 17 counts of murder, but was tried for 15 of them. He pleaded guilty, but insane, citing his mental state and compulsions. The jury found him sane and guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, without the possibility of parole. Dahmer died on November 28, 1994, when he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate while performing cleaning duties in the prison gym. Jeffrey Dahmer's life and crimes became a subject of study, highlighting issues of mental health and the dark aspects of human nature. H. Holmes. Holmes, also known as Herman Webster Mudgett, was born on May 16, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. He was an intelligent child that showed an early interest in medicine. He initially attended the University of Vermont and finished his degree at the University of Michigan in 1884. Holmes had previous crimes before becoming a serial killer. He was engaged in various scams involving insurance fraud, taking out policies on fictitious people, and then collecting the money after staging their deaths. Later, Holmes moved to Chicago and began working at a pharmacy. Shortly afterwards, he took over the business after the owner had mysteriously disappeared. This is the advent of his murder sprees. Holmes purchased a lot across the street from the pharmacy and constructed a 3-story building that would later be known as his murder castle. The building was designed with rooms laid out in a labyrinth formation, secret passages, soundproof chambers, trap doors, and a basement equipped with a crematorium and acid vats. His victims would be lured into his murder castle with promises of employment or lodging. His methods of murder varied, including asphyxiation, poisoning, and starvation. He used the castle's secret rooms to trap and kill his victims, often disposing of the bodies in the building's basement. Holmes was eventually arrested in 1894, but initially, it was for insurance fraud. It was only during the investigations that authorities discovered his murders. Holmes confessed to 27 murders, but the true number of his victims is believed to be much higher. He was tried and convicted for the murder of his business partner, with further investigations linked him to multiple other murders. His reign as America's first serial killer ended when he was sentenced to death by hanging in 1896. Ted Bundy. Theodore Robert Cowell, known as Ted Bundy, was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. Bundy had a relatively normal childhood and school life. It wasn't until 1974 when his first confirmed attack was reported. He typically would target young women in the Seattle area, approaching his victims in public areas, feigning injury, or impersonating an authority figure to gain their trust, and then abducting them. He would then take them to secluded locations, where he would assault, murder, and violate their corpses. He was first arrested in Utah of 1975 for aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. Escaping from custody on numerous occasions, he fled to Florida, where he brutally attacked a sorority house at Florida State University and unalived 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. On February 15, 1978, Bundy was finally caught and faced multiple trials for the crimes he committed. The strange thing was that he acted as his own attorney during the trials, engaging in erratic and bizarre behaviors. This ultimately led to his death sentence by the electric chair on January 24, 1989. Bundy became notorious due to his high charisma and intelligence, serving as a chilling reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist behind a charming mask. John Wayne Gacy. Gacy was also known as the Killer Clown, born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. He had a rough childhood with an abusive father. He was terrifying because he led a double life as Pogo the Clown, participating at birthday parties and charity events. Away from prying eyes, he would lure young men and boys, offering employment, drugs, and alcohol. Once they were inside his home, he would violate, assault, and then strangle them. Keeping a detailed journal, and sometimes even a trophy from each body, he would then bury them beneath his house. A few other bodied were also discovered in the river nearby. The clown's downfall started with the disappearance of Robert, a 15-year-old boy. Robert was last seen heading towards Gacy's residence to meet about a potential job. Afterwards, authorities began to watch Gacy and discovered multitudes of incriminating evidence that linked him to all of the missing people. On December of 1978, Gacy was arrested and confessed to the murders of 33 young men and boys after the police found human remains in his home. He was convicted and sentenced to death and spent 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois. May 10, 1994, John Killer Clown Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Aileen Wuornos, born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Her troubled parents abandoned her at a young age, leaving her to be raised by abusive grandparents. By Aileen's early teens, she was abandoned again and engaged in prostitution to survive. She married at the age of 20, but due to her lifestyle and history, she developed violent tendencies that caused her eventual divorce after a few months. She was involved with various criminal activities such as theft, forgery, and armed robbery. She spent most of her life drifting around the highways of Florida, engaging in a degenerate lifestyle to support herself. Between the years of 1989 and 1990, Wuornos killed 7 men, claiming they were going to violate and assault her. Her motives at the time were self-defense. Her methods were a close-range shot with a .22 caliber pistol. Afterwards, she would rob them. Wuornos was arrested January of 1991 due to an investigation that linked the series of murders together using the ballistic evidence found at each crime scene. She pled no contest during her court hearing and was found guilty for 7 counts of first-degree murder. Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. Richard Ramirez, born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. Ramirez grew up under an abusive father. Having no role models to look up to, he quickly attached to his older cousin Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran, who exposed Ramirez to graphic images of violence and taught him military skills, further molding his behaviors later in life. Many of the people around Ramirez led rough lives, putting him in an environment of drugs and criminal activities. By the age of 13, Ramirez witnessed his cousin killing his wife, leaving a profound impact on the young teen. Ramirez dropped out of high school and engaged in petty crimes, such as burglary and drug use. His murder spree began around 1984 and were quite random. There was not a pattern to his madness when it comes to choosing his victims. Men, women, children, and the elderly were not discriminated during his slaughters. He would break into their houses at night, earning him the nickname of the Night Stalker. He used a variety of weapons from handguns, knives, and blunt objects. His attacks were marked by their brutality and randomness, sometimes leaving satanic symbols at the crime scenes. He was captured on August 30, 1985, when his photo was widely publicized, resulting in him being recognized and cornered by a mob of people. Richard Ramirez was convicted in 1989 for multiple accounts of murder, sexual assault, and burglary, landing him a death sentence. His sentence was never carried out due to his B-cell lymphoma complications, resulting in his early death. In the end, he was never remorseful of his crimes and diligently showed his allegiance to Satan. Ed Gein, born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Gein led a very sheltered life under his strict mother. Things took a turn for the worse when his immediate family passed away. He was left alone in an isolated farmhouse, where he began to exhibit increasingly strange behaviors. Gein started off grave-robbing corpses and fashioning them into trophies and keepsakes. He created items from human skin and furniture upholstered with flesh. Events became more twisted when he decided to procure fresh ingredients, leading towards the advent of his murders. He was arrested in 1957 after the disappearance of one of his victims. Police found her body and numerous other human remains on his property. Officially, he was charged with 2 murders, but the true number remains unknown. During his trials, he was found mentally unstable and admitted to a hospital for the criminally insane. Ed Gein died of respiratory failure from lung cancer while institutionalized in 1984. His notoriety sparked inspiration for many stories and film for time to come. Charles Manson, born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio. Throughout his childhood and adolescent years, Manson was in and out of the government systems. Whether it was foster care, reform schools, or juvenile detention centers, he was a magnet for trouble wherever he went. This carried over to his adult life, where he was also in and out of prison for various offenses. When Manson was released from prison in 1967, he moved to San Francisco at the height of the countercultural movement. This is where his charms and strong belief within the movement began to attract a group of followers who were predominantly young women. The group came to be known as the Manson family. They lived a nomadic lifestyle, but eventually settled down in the California desert at an abandoned movie set. There, Manson preached a blend of Scientology, the Beatles' music, and his disturbing visions. He had a firm belief of a purging through a racial war, convincing his followers to commit murders and frame African Americans to provoke a societal collapse. Manson would then guide his followers into carrying out his visions like a pack of rabid dogs. Although his connections to the murders were unclear at first, several of his family were arrested for unrelated charges. Eventually, evidence linked them to one of their recent massacres. While under interrogation, one of the followers confessed, leading to the indictment of Manson and the other members. Initially sentenced to death for their crimes, they got life in prison instead, due to the invalidation of the death penalty in 1972. At the age of 83, Charles Manson died of natural causes while incarcerated. David Berkowitz. Have you ever had a dog tell you to go kill someone? David did. Initially, Berkowitz started engaged in arson and petty theft, but one day he started hearing voices telling him to commit murders. He later attributed these whispers to a demon that possessed his neighbor's dog. With the devil on his shoulder and revolver in hand, he began his spree in 1976, targeting young women and couples sitting in parked cars. Over the next year, Berkowitz developed a taste for specifically young women with long, dark hair. His reign of terror was so impactful that many women in the city changed their hairstyles or wore wigs to avoid standing out. He earned the name Son of Sam when he would send cryptic and bizarre letters to New York newspapers, signing them Son of Sam. Apparently, Sam was the neighbor that owned the dog in which Berkowitz believed to be possessed. Throughout his rampage, he killed 6 people and wounded 7 others, causing the police to launch a massive manhunt. Funny thing is, a parking ticket was his downfall. The ticket was issued to Berkowitz near the scene of one of the shootings, and police connected his car to link him with the crimes. When law enforcement went to arrest Berkowitz outside of his apartment, he immediately confessed and claimed that he was commanded to kill by a demon. Found guilty, he was sentenced to life in prison. Berkowitz claimed to have found religion while locked away, and now refers to himself as the Son of Hope. Expressing remorse for his crimes, he became involved in the prison ministry. Gary Ridgway. Born on February 18, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer, began his killings in the 1980s. He primarily targeted sex workers and runaways in the Seattle and Tacoma areas. His methods involved picking up the women, strangling them in his truck, and then disposing their bodies in remote wooded areas near the Green River, which earned him the name of the Green River Killer. Ridgway would often return to the disposal sites and violate the decomposing bodies. He became notorious due to his consistency and sheer number of victims spanning over 2 decades. The Green River Killer was so elusive that law enforcement enlisted the help of another serial killer, Ted Bundy, to help catch him. It wasn't until the advancement with DNA technology in 2001 that enabled investigators to link Ridgway to several victims through DNA evidence found on the bodies. The killer was arrested shortly afterwards at his workplace, where he had been employed as a painter for the last 32 years. To avoid the death penalty, Ridgway agreed to a plea deal in which he would confess to the murders and provide information on the locations of undiscovered victims. He pleaded guilty to 48 charges of aggravated first-degree murder, although he later claimed to have killed up to 71 women. He is currently serving 48 consecutive life sentences in Washington State Penitentiary. Pedro Alonso Lopez, also known as the Monster of the Andes, due to the scale and brutality of his crimes. Lopez's killing spree began in the 70s, targeting young girls between the age of 8 and 12 throughout Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. He would lure them to secluded areas where he violated and strangled them. In 1980, Lopez was arrested in Ecuador when one of his abductions went wrong. He claimed to have murdered over 300 girls in total, while confessing after his arrest. How authorities got his confession was interesting. Initially, Lopez refused to cooperate and remained silent. Eventually, he began to brag about his crimes to a fellow prisoner while in the holding cell. Little did he know that the other prisoner was the police captain in disguise. Lopez was convicted and sentenced to 16 years in prison, the maximum prison sentence available in Ecuador at the time. He was released and deported back to Colombia, 14 years later for good behavior. He has been under the radar since. In 2002, there was a warrant issued for his arrest due to a murder bearing similarities to his style. To this day, he remains a fugitive. Andrei Chikatilo, also known as the Butcher of Rostov. His first known murder occurred in 1978 when he lured a 9-year-old girl to an old house where he violated, strangled, and dismembered the body. Over the next 12 years, Chikatilo targeted women and children in the same fashion. His crimes were characterized by extreme violence, with some cases involving cannibalism. The Butcher was evasive. Many innocent men were wrongfully convicted and executed for his crimes. He was arrested in 1984 on suspicion of theft. During questioning, police found evidence linking him to several murders, but due to a lack of concrete evidence, he was released. Soviet law enforcement ran into Chikatilo again in 1990, where he was observed acting suspiciously near a train station where several victims had been found. This time, forensic evidence and his detailed confession led to his indictment. The Butcher confessed to 56 murders, providing excruciating details of his methods and motivations. He explained that he derived immense sexual pleasure in his crimes. In 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head. Albert Fish. Orphaned at a young age, Fish had several mental illnesses where he derived pleasure from his abuse. This marked the start of his lifelong sadomasochistic tendencies. Fish led a life of indulging in violent behaviors, self-harm, and consuming raw meat. His crimes escalated over time, targeting children, becoming more grotesque with cannibalism. He had a few murders over the years of 1924 to 1928. His most notable one was when he claimed a 10-year-old with his urges. He later sent a letter to the child's family, describing the murder in detail. This letter led to his capture. The envelope contained hints that pointed towards his identity. Fish was arrested in 1934 and sentenced to death in 1936 by the electric chair. Elizabeth Bathory, also known as the Blood Countess. Elizabeth belonged to one of the most powerful and wealthy families in Transylvania. She was highly educated and ruled with her husband over their estates. She was known for her cruelty towards servants and peasants. Rumors and accusations began to circulate around Elizabeth, telling stories of her torturing and killing numerous young girls. There was even a rumor that Bathory would bathe in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. The total number of victims are estimated to range from a few dozen to over 600. These rumors were getting out of hand, so the king ordered an investigation that led to testimonies collected from over 300 witnesses, and Elizabeth being caught in the act of torture. Bathory was never tried, although her accomplices were found guilty and executed. This was probably due to her high social status that spared her from execution. She was instead imprisoned to a select few rooms within the castle she tortured others in, where she remained until her death.